Good evening and welcome to today's edition of Supply Chain Talks. My name is Sam Champong. I'm the regional head of CIPS for the MENA region. The subject for today's session is supply chain disruption and how we can build supply chains to withstand the impact of disruptive events. Now, I'm based in Dubai, where the World Expo is currently being hosted, and Dubai Expo 2020 was actually delayed by 12 months as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which you're all in agreement is a supply chain disruption like no other in modern times. So to discuss the subject of supply chain disruptions and how to mitigate against them, we've got some great guests who can add context, comment, and experience to some of the current issues. If you have any questions or comments as we go through the session, please submit them via the Q&A or chat section on your screen, and we'll pick them up as we move along. So to start off, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Gail Hutt. Gail is a supply chain leader with vast experience in running, improving, and transforming end-to-end supply chains in complex and changing environments. She's currently Chief Supply Chain Officer at Twinings and was previously at Diageo. Gail, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome to the session.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Great. So as you're aware, Gail, it was announced on Monday that the UK government have appointed Sir David Lewis, former CEO of Tesco, as the government's supply chain advisor. So my first question to you on that current topic, Gail, is what's your view on this appointment? And I guess what impact do you think it will have in mitigating some of the supply chain issues we're seeing today?
So I'm going to try to answer the question in two parts. Yeah. So I think first, I just want to comment on the intent, and then second on the effectiveness. So if we reflect on the past couple of years, UK has had many visible supply chain issues. And when you compare it to other European countries, they seems to have either been less or not impacted at all, or be able to recover faster. So the examples I have in mind are not just COVID, yeah, but the examples I have in mind: fuel shortage, more recently, empty shelves, congestion at port, as well as import, export, post-Brexit, or even PPE supply during COVID, especially at the beginning. So I think with this in mind, I think appointing a supply chain advisor to the government is a really good idea. I guess we wish we had done it sooner, but it's always easier with hindsight. And Brexit is a good example where I think the impact at borders could have been assessed better in order to put the right process in place from day one, rather than having to play catch up. So that would be one example where I think a supply chain advisor can add a lot of value. Now, the second part of the things, if we talk about the effectiveness of the appointment, I guess appointing someone in October, hoping that this person is going to be able to fix Christmas, which from a supply chain perspective is today. So fix Christmas and also establish long-term action plans to preempt future issues in the space of 3 months, I think is extremely ambitious. But yes, the proof will be in the pudding, I guess.
Proof will be in the pudding, indeed. I guess it's better late than never is another kind of attitude
yes.
You could put to that. Yes. Okay, but I suppose, Gail, you've lived and worked in many places around the world. Are you aware of any other countries having this kind of appointment or direct responsibility for supply chain at government level?
That's a good question. I'm actually not aware of other countries having that. That doesn't mean that they don't exist, though.
Well, there you go. No, absolutely. Now, Gail, I think I started the segment talking about COVID-19, which obviously we have to, because that's the biggest single supply disruptor in any of our lifetimes, I'd imagine. What were the impacts on your business, and is there anything you perhaps would have done differently in hindsight to mitigate some of the effects of the pandemic?
So I mean, COVID-19 is one thing that we are living with for the past couple of years now, and is a huge disruption. But I think there is a lesson, or maybe if we elevate the debate to the title and about disruption overall, we all know that we are experiencing much more disruption now than 10 years ago, for example. And therefore, being able to build our muscle or our supply chain muscle to mitigate those disruptions becomes critical and becomes a competitive advantage as well. If I think about how we've been trying to mitigate those disruptions in Twinings Ovaltine, I guess I can group them into three big themes. The first one is the end-to-end collaboration. The second one is process and systems. So I'll talk a little bit about technology. And then the third one is people. So if I think about end-to-end collaboration, I think it's supply chain sometimes is seen as a supplier, I guess, or support. But we've really, I think the past 2 years have shown that end-to-end collaboration internally across our business, but also externally, so within the ecosystem, so with suppliers and retailers, is one of the things that is critical to build a resilience. Yeah. So, for example, in Twinings, we've worked with some of our suppliers really, really closely to smooth the bullwhip effect of our demand, to give them more stability, which means that they can plan better. So that's one area that we focused on. And then another example would be we've worked with our markets who worked also with their customer and retailers to simplify our portfolio. So we simplify our business, and that means that gives us more stability and more choices in one. So that would be around the end-to-end collaboration. Around process and systems, we talk a lot about, a lot of people talk about agility. And for me, sometimes when we talk about agility, people have in mind, oh, therefore we need to be highly flexible and look at everything, be flexible on everything. I think for me, what agility means is the right balance between efficiency and flexibility. So how are we being decisive and choiceful when and where we want to be flexible, and when and where we want to be efficient. So our focus in Twinings Over has been, okay, let's use every opportunity to drive efficiencies on repetitive, non-value added tasks to free up time for people to think about creatively when either a disruption occurred or when we want to make our own disruption, so create, launch a new product, etc., etc. So I think that's one area where technology and driving efficiency through processes can really help us to build resilience in our supply chain. And then also, because I'm a big believer that never waste a good crisis, it's been also a really good opportunity to put forward big technology investments. Sometimes it's hard to see or to quantify the return of investment when we want to invest on technology. Therefore, it's always put at the back of the list, or the priority list. Whereas we found that being able to use a crisis or a disruption as an opportunity to put a case forward for big technology investments that will accelerate long-term improvement has been really useful. So, for example, for when I see people, and we haven't done that yet, but when I see companies that have the technology to have real-time transportation, visibility, and synchronization and orchestration, they've had a huge advantage. So when Suez Canal happened, then that means that they can reroute really quickly. They know exactly where their containers are. And that puts them as an advantage. So that would be one example. But also another example where we spend a lot of time is scenario planning. So companies that have invested in end-to-end data transparency and synchronization and being able to have tools to do scenario planning also have have been to an advantage, because otherwise you do it by hand and it's very time consuming, etc. So you spend more time crunching the data rather than actually drawing the insight and the opportunities. So that's another example where process and system can really help us to be more resilient and agile in the future. And then the third theme, which is the really important one, which is about people, because people are our most precious asset. It's about protecting our people, and COVID is a really good example where, you know, you can have all the technology in the world, all the end-to-end collaboration in the world, but lots of us have booked tables in the restaurant, and the restaurant calls in and said, sorry, but my staff is sick. Yeah. So to be able to protect our people, have the right health and safety plan, have in current case the right COVID protocols is really critical for the resilience. And then it's the same, is value our people and grow our people, because it goes a long way to create an organization that is more agile and is more resilient again. Yeah. So I think once you know, for us to be able to create that environment that is, you know, more efficient, more flexible, more agile, and therefore more resilient, it not only it make our recovery time, if there is a disruption and we are hit by it, it makes our recovery time shorter, but also it make the number of unfamiliar issues that we experience reduced. Yeah, and actually there is quite a good paper that Gartner published a few months ago on this subject around disruptions and how much you experience and how you can prepare for it. So if some people haven't read it, it's a good read. I would recommend.
Oh, that's a great point. I think the Gartner piece will be a good thing to pass on to some of the audience. Thanks for that. And I think you pulled out some very, very good points, especially around peoplehood, because that's often ignored when we start talking about supply chain disruptions. There's a reliance on people there, but you also touched on technology and obviously resilience, but also scenario planning, which again I think is often neglected in trying to mitigate supply chain disruption. So thanks for that. And I think certainly looking at the chat, there's a lot of people who are glad that you've done some of the actions you've done to keep tea on our shelves and in our homes. So well done. Thanks, Gail. At this point, I'd like to bring in our other guest to the session. So joining us, we have Alan Barrett, Supply Chain Director at Cox Automotive. And Alan has over 34 years experience working in supply chains across the globe, primarily managing matrix supply chains for major organizations. And we have Murray Dilts, who has over 30 years experience in procurement, supply chain and operations, and is currently supply chain director for the animal health company Covitrus. So gents, you're very welcome.
Hi Sam, and thanks for the intro. Lovely to be here. And Gail, thanks for keeping the tea bags flowing. That's really important for the British workforce.
I think that goes without saying. So we'll start with you, Alan, if we may. So you work for one of the largest automotive service organizations in the world. Perhaps you can tell us, what are the current supply chain issues affecting your industry?
Well, Cox Automotive, we remarket cars, so we're basically selling cars midlife or early in the end of its life, and remarketing those cars through supply chains. And what we're seeing is a pent-up demand driven by COVID. A lot of people sat at home and been able to save money from not traveling, not going on holidays, and obviously they've got cash to spend on big ticket items, and cars are one of those. What we're seeing is obviously the supply chain. You know, if we look at global supply chains, the COVID was probably not a typical risk event thing that you really plan and forecast for. And the consequence of that, a lot of you will have heard about the semiconductor issue in the car production plants around the world. It may shock you to know that the average modern car has 1,500 microchips in it in one vehicle. So this isn't just a few chips in a car; it's thousands of chips that are going into a vehicle, and those are in really short supply. The manufacturing changed as the COVID crisis hit because of just-in-time supply chains, and I'm sure we're going to get on and talk about that. And has it a future? Those supply chains have become very fragmented and fractured extremely quickly in an interconnected world. And that means that we can't produce cars. And ultimately, for us as a business, we don't see people defleeting vehicles because they can't buy new ones. So for us, it's more about an impact on our business. In terms of our supply chain in Cox, we've been very resilient to the COVID impact. So, we have a car refurbishing part of our business called Mannheim Vehicle Solutions. We do body repairs on cars, and then we resell those on an industrial scale. We've managed to protect those supply chains through the partners we've worked with and through warehousing and distribution in the UK, which I have to say was largely planned for Brexit impacting us, and the consequence of planning for those changes actually played to our strengths when COVID hit, because we were already planning for disruption in supply chains because of Brexit. So largely we've been pretty resilient, but I know Murray works in pharma, so that's probably a different problem thing. I don't know, Murray, what your experiences were.
I think that's a good perspective you're giving on your industry, because obviously what you're saying is that it's just the ability or the inability rather to produce new cars, and that's having a direct impact on the cost of the used cars in your business. So an interesting perspective there. But as you said, Murray, please share what the impacts have been on your side of the fence, because that should be quite insightful.
So I've only recently joined Covetrus, but I moved companies during COVID, and it's interesting to see how two different, and I worked in a different sector. I've worked in pharma in the past. I worked in aerospace and defence, so it's a bit of a change. But I think when I think back to kind of risk in supply chains and the events I just listed while Alan and Gail were talking, some of the events that we've seen in recent times: volcanoes, tsunamis, Brexit, floods, foot and mouth, COVID, and unique to me, I even had a hostage situation, but that's another situation. That's in Russia to deal with. All potential force majeure events. And I think what we've done is we've got very good at adapting and getting supply chains more agile, and echoing really what Gail was saying. And I think what we're getting better at is things like transparency, really getting to understand your end-to-end supply chain, not limiting it to that buyer-supplier relationship, but taking your supply chain further back through the tiers and back through the suppliers, and also forward into the customer end of the supply chain. So I think we've got a lot better at that. There's more transparency, there's more awareness, there's more understanding. And I think if you do that, you've got more chance of sharing risk and responding to it more quickly. Just again, picking up on some of the kind of points that have already been raised regarding COVID, this specific issue that we have now. I think both companies I've worked for responded really well. I was in aerospace and defence. Yes, we had kind of large numbers of people that we had to try and keep on site. We were maintaining aircraft, military aircraft, and I think we were already working well with the supply chain, with suppliers. Again, carry over a bit from Brexit, which pushed us to really understand our supply chains well. And I think we benefited from that with COVID. We were kind of prepared in a sort of way for an event. I think the technology as well, the transparency in the supply chain, we'd improved through kind of past events. So I think generally, I think the things that are affecting us now are more difficult. Oil prices going up, gas prices going up, the impact, the driver shortage that we'll probably come on to later. And if I could just finish on one last thing, that again, Gail, I think the one thing that COVID has done is was certainly from working from home, both in the companies I work and supply impacting on suppliers is I think we're dealing with mental health a lot better and people's well-being, and I think we're taking far more responsible attitude and approaches to that, to understanding the issues that people might be having. I think again, pinching Gail's point, out of a crisis, I think there's a lot of good come out.
I agree with that. I mean, just as a side, Gail, you mentioned putting people first is a key priority, and David Murray, you've just mentioned that again now, and I completely agree with you both. I think people are certainly the bedrock of our organisation. We put in place pre-COVID 75 mental health first aiders across the business, and we're looking to put another 100 into the group to do that. And actually, that foresight, I think, has definitely helped. If you think about some of the things we've had to do in this crisis management, and you're absolutely right, Murray, we've had tsunamis before and all sorts of force majeure events that have thrown us off course as supply chain leaders. But one thing that we haven't probably had to deal with before is dealing that in isolation, working from home through computer screens and Teams calls, and not having that collaboration in a workforce, being able to throw things up on a whiteboard. We've all done it. That has been challenging. And I think making sure that putting people first has definitely been a benefit in our organisation. And from what I'm hearing, certainly that's the same in Twinings and the same in your organisation, Murray, where those values have come to the fore really at a moment of crisis. And I think that's really important, and we should continue to work to do that as leaders moving forward. Just coming back to the introduction topic on Sir David. Don't know Sir David. I'm sure he's an admirable guy. My challenge around this is, I think this is about movement of goods and getting. Everybody wants to get a turkey for Christmas and toys to their children and grandchildren and stuff like that. I'm not sure that he's going to have the skills and bandwidth to do this on time. And the skills as in, what about the rest of it? What about the skilled workers in the car industry that we need to spray cars, fix cars? What about hospitality workers? What about the NHS workers? So I see two major things here. The lack of labour and ability to get labour in the supply chain, which is people again, is very problematic at the minute. Is Sir David going to address that, and how? And number two is obviously there's how do you get HGV drivers in this massively challenging time frame? I think Gail, you mentioned it in your intro, a little bit too late, and a really ambitious timeline for him to try and come on board and address those issues. One paper I would draw people to, if you are in logistics and immediately hit by HGV stuff and moving stuff around, look at the Barclays Logistics Conference 2021 paper, which we'll put up for you. That is a really interesting read on the impact of that, and I'm sure Sir David will be looking closely at that. Food and that sector, I think he's going to be great in, but I think the wider, these interlinked supply chains, I'm not sure he's going to get the bandwidth to do all of that sort of stuff, and a lot of that is here and now, particularly around labour, is my view.
Thanks for interjecting there, Alan. Some very good points which pick up on what Gail said, and I think Gail said something similar in that appointing somebody at this stage to avert supply chain disruptions at Christmas is a little bit ambitious. And I think going back into the article, I noticed that his actual appointment is only till the end of this year. Anyway, yes. So that's an interesting take as well. But I think as a panel, you brought out something very, very interesting, which is prioritising people's welfare to mitigate supply chain disruptions. And I think that's a really interesting theme that's going to come out of this session, because I don't think there's enough focus on that. But thanks as a panel, all three of you, bringing that very important part out. Now, I'm going to go to the Q&A section now, and I'll pick up a question that's coming from Paul O'Neill. And this is going to Gail, actually. And the question is, how do Twinings prioritise risk around supply chain with production expectations? Do you weight fuel and energy against raw materials? Do you stock raw product materials? Do you have any energy reserves or contingency plans? And also, It's a long question. Also, what do you look for as key deliverables in subcontractors and suppliers? Do Twinings prioritize cost or security? Gail.
Oh, it's a very long question.
It is.
So I'm going to try to answer in also in different parts. So we don't have a perishable product. So I guess, for people who work in companies with more perishable product is maybe it's a bit different. Yeah. So for us, and also it's seasonal. So as you can see, as you can imagine, tea and harvesting tea, etc., etc. You can't buy it. There are some season where you buy, and then some season that you can't buy. So I think it's a mix of all of what you said. So it's a mix of really for things that are just in time, so packaging material, etc., etc. Then we would have really close collaboration with our suppliers. And then we would assess different risks, profile. And then for the other ones that are more seasonal, then we would have more stock, as a buffer things. And I guess the question about prioritizing cost or sales or I can't remember the exact questions now, but I think. At this point in time, it's more important to have your product on shelf than having a little bit more inventory to create the buffer. So I think what we've done is twofold. Is one, simplification of our portfolio, so we don't end up with lots of product in our warehouse that we don't need. So focus a little bit on our portfolio. But also that means that we can create a little bit more buffer and a little bit more stock to compensate for the volatility of the demand. So that's how we've kind of built our resilience. Although it's not for everything, and it's not a blanket approach for all of our product, but it's much more focused on where we think the biggest risk areas are.
Awesome, great answer. So I think what you're saying, it's not a carte blanche. It's a mixed bag, and it depends what product you're talking about. And there are going to be variations on your approach depending on time, product, etc. So, but obviously that's based on your own supply chain assessments.
Exactly.
As to which mitigations you put in place.
And this is where again, the theme of end-to-end collaboration is critical, because you can only assess these risks if you are connected end to end. If you only assess this risk in a silo manner, so what is the risk for manufacturing, or what is the risk from a supplier point of view, or what is the risk from a customer, you end up with the wrong answer. So that end-to-end collaboration and that cross-functional risk assessment and therefore scenario planning is really helping to get to the right answer.
Incredible. Thanks for that, Gail. Thanks very much. And I'll go back to the panel Q&A again. So we have another question that's saying, and this is in relation to some of the government's mitigations that have already been put in place against things like the lack of labour around HGV drivers, etc. So the question is, does the panel agree that we need to be weaned off cheap labour and start to invest in the technology that will improve productivity? Alan, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam. Great question from Ashley Cook there on do we want to be weaned off cheap labour? The answer, Ashley, is yes. In my view, my sort of quandrum on that is I don't think the timing's right. We've got a government talking up high wage economy. But we're bordering on the risk of fueling I think, inflation. I think inflation is going to be the next problem that we're going to have to face. It could hit 6%, I think, in the immediate near future. And with a capital debt of 2 trillion, that's probably not a great place to be either. So if from a government point of view, I am a little bit taken aback with the approach of pushing this agenda so fast, so quickly, particularly at this point in the economic cycle. And it'll be interesting to see what the Chancellor does next month and how he's going to start to address some of these bigger problems. But without turning this into sort of a political quandrum, although it is led by government, I think that the essence of coming off cheap labour is the right way to go. And I think the over-reliance on it, I think, is now coming to its fore now, particularly in the UK. And, I think, again, Gail mentioned it in the opening statement, looking in her role around Europe, where does she see these stresses and strains? There is a labour shortage in Europe. We're not, these HGV problems are manifesting in the UK because we're a big importer and exporter, and we're getting that immediate impact. But it is right across Europe. But this cheap labour that sort of sits in the service industry, service sector, semi and low skill, these people are now transiting across sectors that are still here in the UK, and we're not getting any more people in. I can tell you that I work with a couple of big organisations I'm not going to name, but they are reliant on foreign and imported labour. They've lobbied government, and government have took a position that they are not going to release the licences to bring these people in to see what the effect of the furlough is, or the end of furlough, so that those people can then move sectors into new roles. I just don't see some of that happening. People in offices aren't going to all of a sudden going to want to work in a poultry factory. So I think this is it's admirable. It's the right thing to do. I think the timing is going to be a little bit wrong. Is my fear, and I think it'll fuel inflation, and that's probably a bigger demon than really looking again at immigration policies and letting more people in. Is my view, even on a points-based system, which I support. But you can have a points-based system, but we don't seem to be doing it. Is my view.
Can I just add the driver shortage? I think it's clearly a very serious issue. It's a serious issue. It's across Europe. And it might answer that question about wage inflation as well. It may be that the driver shortage actually does push up the wage. It almost certainly will. There are also driver shortages across the US. I was reading yesterday that the reports on the west coast of the US, they've got 70 container ships out waiting. They can't get drivers to take the containers away. And this is happening, I'm told this morning, this is happening in Felixstowe as well. There's a real backlog at Felixstowe at the moment. I'm sure people that are involved in the importing are already aware of this. And part of the problem is there's a build-up of containers at Felixstowe because they haven't got the drivers to take them away. So I think this is serious. Going back also, even to the question about David Lewis, pleased that they've put it, but like everybody, I don't know what he's going to do in 3 months. He's not going to change the oil price. He's not going to suddenly find 100,000 drivers. I just can't. I don't know how he can impact it in 3 months. Sorry, a bit of a quick, not getting too political as well.
Yeah.
So technology is no silver bullet. Anything else to add to that, Gail?
No, I have no other points.
Fantastic. Okay, so going back to questions, we have another one, and this actually goes back to what we're doing with suppliers and whether systems that we use to, I guess, evaluate suppliers are fit for purpose. So the question actually says, do we relying solely on a point-in-time vendor attestation questionnaire cannot deliver the required level of insight? So it'll be interesting from the panel, I guess, to how do you ensure you have the right suppliers on board, and how do you implement the required amount of scrutiny on your suppliers? Maybe we'll kick off with Murray this time.
So I think the actual approval process shouldn't change too much. You still got, some of us work in very highly regulated industries. You still have a process to go through to make sure you're identifying and using the right suppliers. But what I think you can do is there's a couple of things I'd kind of guide people on. I think be careful of the short-term fixes. if you're tempted to change supplier, there may be a necessity, multi-sourcing, dual sourcing, going from a different sourcing strategy, but always retain the long-term view. Don't burn bridges at this point. The supply market in a lot of areas, we're not blessed with kind of very liquid supply markets at the moment. So the first thing is, yes, resolve the short term, but always keep your mind on the long term. The other thing which is sort of something which I've done is, and this may be hard again for some people in different industries, is don't get to be a bit more relaxed about the contractual arrangements that you have. That doesn't mean you break them, but I've worked in industries very highly contractual, and we have kind of been a little bit more lenient in times of kind of, not I would say crisis, but times of high levels of disruption. So a couple of things there I kind of suggest to people that they look at.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that, Murray. Gail, did you want to add to that? Thought you were.
I just want to add on Murray, just to pick on something that you said was, in terms of the screening. Yeah, you didn't say that word, but I can't remember exactly. So for us, ethical sourcing is critical because, as a global organization, I think it's our duty to make sure that we improve life in the community we operate in. So to really help people improve and then have ethical sourcing is key. Therefore, the screening and the process of selecting the right suppliers, I think is really good, because it improves everything. So that I agree, that won't change. In terms of, we need to look after our suppliers. So I think this is where, again, end-to-end collaboration on the front end and be really close and be empathetic about, and this is where, it goes beyond, to be able to be agile and resilient, it goes beyond transactional relationship, but it's more of a partnership. And because if our supplier base is experiencing all the disruptions and they can't survive, then we have no supply chain continuity. So I think it's really that collaboration and be empathetic towards each other rather than maybe contractual and transactional. I think, Murray, you mentioned the contract, be a little bit more flexible on the contract, is then becomes critical for the supply chain continuity.
Okay, and now in automotive, is it a partnership approach, or are you applying a lot more scrutiny?
We've always applied a great deal of scrutiny on our PQQ process in Cox. It's quite a rigid process to get in. We're not as heavily regulated as marine pharma, and I do come from a pharma background, so I know how difficult that can be at times. But we have a rigid process. What we do is exactly what Murray was talking about before, is we work on long-term strategic partnerships. Now, the reason why we do that is that, when the chips are down and we hit a global crisis like we have done with COVID and Brexit and everything else that's thrown at us, that flexibility and close collaboration and working, and Gail, you've said it a few times on this call, is about that end-to-end collaboration and understanding the stresses and strains that are in your suppliers and working with them to overcome that. Some of the examples we've done is we've accelerated payment terms with suppliers to help them through cash flow problems, particularly where they're labour centric and they've had problems. Taking Murray's example, we've relaxed KPI and SLA and punitive damages in certain contracts to not punish suppliers. And that goes an awful long way. And I think when you work in supply chain, all of us on this call and the audience listening will have suppliers that they can immediately look to, and they know that they're getting an awful lot of goodwill in all sorts of stuff and going above and beyond for you. So that is about the key thing about being a really good supply chain person, is having really good relationships. and building on the foundations of that. We very seldom swap suppliers out in Cox. We do it, but not very often. We tend to take small companies and let them grow with us and develop with us, and move into other parts of our branding and stuff like that. That it's much easier to work with a supplier than go out and get new ones and to go through all the pain and learning curve of that.
So the scrutiny comes up front, but then the partnership comes after that, in effect. So you put the effort in.
The other thing that's worked well for us is we've graded suppliers. We do a sort of a bronze, silver, gold, and approved. That generates sort of you can use that to your advantage in negotiations, and get that cauldron going of people want to compete against each other to get your favour. But more importantly, it actually recognises where that supplier sits in your organisation, and we do a supplier rewards programme. We want to do just prior to COVID, we were planning a supplier events of the evening where we give suppliers awards for how they've worked with us. Best one for innovation, best one for green agenda, best one for collaboration, etc. Not a lot of companies will do that, but I think that's a really another sort of innovative way where you can work closely with your supply chain and actually make sure that they feel valued and integrated part of your solution.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Alan. And I'm going to go back to the Q&A again, and I think addressing James Smith's question. So we've had COVID, or we haven't. We're still in the midst of it, I guess, to be fair. But we've witnessed a lot more supply chain disruptions recently, as per the report that Gail alluded to. And you've spoken about some of the mitigating actions that you've taken, from people to technology to how you're partnering with suppliers. So are you there now? So in other words, are you right sized? Are you right shaped as far as your supply chain planning or your supply chain strategies? Or, as James is asking, will you have to, is there any redesign that you need to do on your supply chains to be even smarter, stronger, or more diverse? Or, as James is saying, are they already optimized in areas such as cost, service, and resilience? So a long question, but a very relevant one. So, because we've spoken about some of the issues, but in all your organizations, are you there? And if not, what do you need to do? Perhaps, Gail, you want to start and give your perspective.
Sure, of course not. It would be very, no, of course, we always have to evolve and improve. And although I don't really like the continuous improvement word, because it feels like, oh my God, if we are here 50 years, we'll never get there. Yeah. But I think it's a constant evolution. Yeah. And it's learning. It's a learning journey that we all learn together. And yeah, it's definitely constant evolution. I think we are for us. We've made huge improvement. So we have great values and we have great ethical sourcing capabilities. We've been really resilient in terms of our supply chain continuity, but where I see where we can really improve is on technology. I think when we talk about end-to-end data transparency, end-to-end synchronization of planning, real-time transportation visibility and orchestration. So I think for me, that's these are the things that can really drive effectiveness and efficiencies, and then we can focus on bigger and better things as well. Yeah. So I think we've got definitely lots of progress still to make, and that's what makes it exciting.
Excellent, Gail. Murray, any?
No, I
from your perspective,
what
more do you need to do?
We're not there. You can never be there, because you're always striving to be better at whatever kind of base level you're at. I think the thing I'd say in terms of thinking about kind of risk in supply chain, one thing I would say is that we've talked about different types of events. I don't want to be the bringer of doom, but there will be another event. There'll be something else, and it is all about how prepared you are for any event. So I often, when we sit down and we start to talk about risk, I say the starting point is, imagine you can't get that product at that service. Doesn't matter what the cause is. The starting point is you can't get that. What are you going to do? And then you can start to break down and look into the kind of where the kind of high risks of the scenarios might be. But no, in terms of what we can do better, I think COVID has, in a funny way, has brought us closer to a lot of suppliers. We kind of understand them a bit better, and I think that's still a kind of area we can get even better at, understanding the suppliers, the dynamics, what issues they're having, and taking further down the supply chain at both kind of ends, customer and supplier.
I think that's a good way to think. Imagine not having that product, and I think we keep going back to tea, don't we? So imagine not having your tea bags in your house.
Well, can I just say, not only was tea, I'd be interested to know from Gail if tea sales grew in the last during COVID, but at Covetrus, pets, of course, there was a boom in pets, so we were really busy. Because we supply vaccines and medicines for vets, so companion animal market was surging across Europe.
Wow, interesting. Well, I'm going to leave the final word to Alan, so you can tell us what you're going to do next, and how it's going to improve your current state.
Sure. Well, I'm on the same page as my colleagues. The answer is no. We can never be perfect. We strive for it. I think what it's told us is our supply chain that we've built has been remarkably resilient, given what we've faced into. Could it be better? Yes. I think it's actually coming out of COVID where we're seeing the biggest problems are now actually for us. I wouldn't say we were perfect through the COVID, but nothing fell over, nothing broke. We operated fine. I wouldn't say it wasn't without its moments, but nevertheless we got through it. The problems now is very much labour and skilled labour, movement of labour. The HGV driver problem is less of an impact, but it will obviously impact supply chain further down. That's what we need to address. That's the here and now, and it's not going to be an easy fix.
And I think that's been a theme throughout the whole panel. There's no easy fixes. There are some plasters being put across some of the issues, and I think one of them may be related to our headline subjects that we mentioned. But let's hope there's some more kind of long-term supply chain mitigation strategies that we can put in place. But it seems certainly within your own organisations, I think there's been some very innovative measures you've all put in, and lots of lessons learnt across all your organisations. I'm just going to end by saying you've been a fantastic panel. I think we've touched on subjects that perhaps we didn't expect to come out, such as and the one for me really was the prioritization rather on people development as a mitigation against supply chain disruption. And it seems such an obvious one, but I think people don't often put enough focus on that, I guess, because it's not seen as being that important, but it certainly is one. So thanks for being a great panel, and to everyone who participated in the session and asked questions. Some great questions came out, which really elicited some really good responses from the panel. Look out for next week's Supply Chain Talk as well. Same time, same place. We really do hope to see you, and we're going to be talking about approaches to identifying cyber risk in your supply chain next week, which should be really interesting. We'll have another great panel. So once again, thanks for attending. Thanks for being a great panel. Thanks for being a great audience. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.